From the United Nations Office to the African Union, this is She Stands for Peace. I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, and in this podcast, I speak with thought leaders and peace builders who share their reflections and best practices towards achieving objectives of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in Africa. In this episode, I'm joined by two guests, both of whom are journalists. Amal Habbani, who joins me from Ontario, Canada, and Comfort Mussa, who joins me from Yaoundé, Cameroon. And we have a conversation about women, media, and peace building. Amal and Comfort, it's a pleasure to speak with you today. As an African woman in media myself, I'm often asked to speak about the role women in media play in various contexts, one of which is peace and security. Let me start by posing the question to you. Do you consider yourself as having a role to play, first as a journalist and second as a woman journalist in the Women, Peace and Security Agenda? And if so, what is this role? And if not, why? So Comfort, to you first.
Thank you, Dr. Yemisi. Yes, I believe and I know for sure that I have a major role to play in the women, peace and security movement. And this is because when we talk about peace and security, of course, we're looking at context where there is conflict. And in my case in Cameroon, it is an armed conflict. And in the context of an armed conflict, people need shelter, water, medications. And I think that they need right information in the right dose, well treated, as much as they need water. So in a context situation, right information is an emergency need. And so that is where my role as a journalist comes into play, and my role as a female journalist more so.
And what in particular makes you being a woman, a female journalist, particularly different from any other journalist?
As a female journalist, I bring perspectives and experiences into the newsrooms that my male colleagues may lack. I give you an example in Cameroon, where we've had an armed conflict in the northwest and southwest regions of the country. We had reports from a particular community for a very long time, but the day some women visited the IDP camps, they came up with the story that the displaced persons, the IDPs in that camp, did not have sanitary pads, sanitary towels. So the women were using leaves during their period. And this was an IDP camp that had been visited by several humanitarian groups, but they just did not think about it until another woman got there and said, but wait, what do you use now that you're so far from home? And there was this big story, trending story that came out of it. And now humanitarian actors, started including that in their care package.
That's very interesting. Amal, do you think as a woman journalist, you have a role to play in WPS agenda? And if so, what is that? And if not, why?
I have a big role to play as a woman and as a journalist for women peace. And I think it is one of my commitments in life, and one of my priorities as a journalist is to raise up the issue of women in war and to try to get the best solutions for conflict for women in my country, Sudan, or for women in all Africa. And I think there are many aspects that we have to deal with when we're speaking about women in war, peace process for women, because we are as journalists, we have a role of protecting women in conflict areas and covering conflict areas from the vision of women, from the eyes of those women, because they are the most suffering people at that war.
And as you both know, the national action plans that each country develops as a way to implement and localize the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, the United Nations Resolution 1325. I have read several national action plans in African countries, and very few of them speak of or provide for women in media specifically. So South Sudan's National Action Plan is an example of one that I would say did specifically make mention of women in media. So what has been your experience as women in media in reporting peace and security in your respective countries? And I would start with Amal, because your experience of reporting peace and security in Sudan is why you're speaking with me today from Canada as opposed to Sudan.
Yes, for me, because now I'm in Canada, I left Sudan because of I have been tortured a lot and I have been threatened life for me and my children. So I left now for 4 years from Sudan before the revolution, as I told you before. And at that time, before I came to Canada, when I used to work as a journalist in Sudan, I used to cover the issues of women that affected by the war. Like we have a large group of women who are displaced women coming from Darfur area and even from South Sudan and from Nuba Mountain. And most of these women are working in selling in streets. And we have like big problems for them because the government used to have a public order law which see women who working in streets are like prostitute women or like criminalized women who are doing that. I worked in the like rape issues of Korean women by the Janjaweed and by the militias since like last 2 decades. So the most important thing for me was we have to stop this war because if we want to make peace for women, we have to first this war has to stop to make any progress for women issues because women are the most affected people, as I said.
Mm. Comfort, how about you in Cameroon? What has been your experience as a woman in media in reporting peace and security?
My experience has been a very difficult one in the context of the armed conflict, and reporting peace and security makes one a target because, irrespective of the story that you tell, there is going to be someone who is not pleased, no matter how balanced your story is. And so, female journalists, like all the other journalists in Cameroon reporting peace and security, find themselves constantly being the target of, the opposing sides that are fighting in the conflicts that we have. And there's been a lot of trolling. So there are days I get online and I see, people, there have been 2 instances where I had my picture on Facebook tagged as the enemy. And you would wonder, enemy to what, when all you've done is just tell your stories. And we have seen how threats online have translated to attacks offline. And so, in a context of war, if someone puts up your picture online and calls you an enemy, even if they are using a fake account, it terrifies you. And then when it's being shared and you have your picture out there, it's a scary experience, and it comes with a lot of online trolling, sometimes translated to offline incidences. And for me, I've also had family and friends reach out to me to caution me. So there's this extra layer of caution. You tell a story, I've had interviews, and then when you're done, people call you, say, be careful. And they will not tell you what they want, like, just be careful. Your family fears for you, your friends fear for you. And there's just this deep sense of insecurity. You don't know what is coming, for you. And we've had other female journalists who were kidnapped. We've had friends who were kidnapped and tortured, and some were actually videotaped. The torture was videotaped. And so even after the release, there were these videos of the torture online. We've had a female journalist who was working at the radio station, and it was burnt down, and she was kidnapped. And some of these women do not return to journalism. That's the unfortunate thing. The trauma is too deep. Some have not been able to come back to routine reporting. Some have had to take up other trades and learn, different trades, and they may return to journalism, but for now they're just off it. And some it's because of the trauma. Others is because when you're a journalist, a female journalist reporting on peace and security, and you live in that community, you are not an outside observer. You're also being affected by the conflict that you're reporting on. And so we have journalists who have been displaced because of the war. I live in a different town now than the one I lived in 4 or 5 years ago, but I had to move because of the war. And so you are a victim and a storyteller and a survivor, and it's very difficult levels or roles to process per time. And there's also the experience of deep exhaustion, because even if you have a supportive newsroom, to tell a story, you listen from different sources, you get from all over, and you have to process. And what you're processing is actually deep stories of people's traumas. I've listened to some interviews and I could not talk. The stories I did the interview and I had to wait 6 months, for some 1 year, to be able to, report on them because of how deeply traumatizing these stories were. But even listening affects us. I've had a serious burnout, and the doctors told me to stay off journalism for 3 months because of just and sometimes the things that you hear from your sources, you can't even put it out there. And so it stays in your head, it stays in your body, and then you burn out, because also there's a confidentiality, right? You can't tell anyone. So you go to interview someone, they say, this is the beat you can put out. But let me just tell you, these are the beat. And then they give you this deep, traumatizing story that you cannot get to tell out. And on the brighter side, as traumatizing and as difficult as reporting on women, peace, and security is, I have also met some real heroes, women that are making change and trying to contribute to peace. I have met a woman whose husband was killed in the war and beheaded. And a few weeks or months after the husband was killed, she found a new assignment in life to comfort other widows of the war. That for me was inspiring, and getting to meet, women like this. Her story is incredible, how she found a purpose in, molding other people. So sometimes yeah, sometimes it's deeply traumatizing. Sometimes it's also rewarding to witness that kind of bravery. And, it just inspires one too on a deeply personal level.
Mm. And I'm going to come back to what you're saying about the role that women play beyond media, obviously, and the way in which women also are represented, because I think that's all something Amal was speaking about earlier on. But before we move on to that question, if you think about both your experiences that you've just shared as women journalists, the experience of other women journalists, like you said, that exodus of women leaving the industry because they're too traumatized to return. So and then also when you think about the national action plans for your countries, in what ways would you like to see the national action plans and other WPS instruments and frameworks better provide and support your work as women journalists? Comfort, you want to go first?
Yes, first of all, instead of just sitting back and saying women are not included, female journalists are not counted in this action plans, myself and other journalists were beginning to reach out even to the women peace builders to say, when you're advocating for space for more women in these action plans, think about the critical role that female journalists play. And so I did not see myself in this plans. I looked at it and I didn't see our roles as female journalists counted in. And so what I did was 2 weeks ago or so, the network of women peace builders, I had to tell them, you need to make sure that female journalists, are part of this plan. So when you're doing your advocacy, you need to hold space for the female journalists because of what we can contribute to the women peace and security agenda. So we are not included in this action plans as female journalists in Cameroon. But instead of just commenting on that as an individual, I have reached out to some of the key stakeholders and made this request, and it's yielding some fruits. There's a major organization that was planning a women's peace treaty convening, and they reached out and said, hey, Comfort, we heard you when you said we're not considering female journalists. We're having this meeting and we would like you to come and make your input. So even when we are not counted, even when we are not included, I think as female journalists in a context of conflict that is affecting us as citizens, we have to push, we have to ask for that space to be created for us.
And Amal, how about you? Thinking about these situations in Sudan, how would you like to see the national action plan in Sudan better provide for women in media?
So, first thing for women is to have justice as victims of war, and also the political participation. women have to be participated and to be very involved in decision making. After the revolution in Sudan, women have been like neglected and out of the political process. We have to make the strategies because we have like a clear vision of peace. We know how peace is good for us, how peace is good for our children who are fighting together.
Of course, the other side of this discussion, I think, which is what you're trying to allude to, is peace building beyond the women journalists themselves as agents of peace, is the representation of women and women's voices in peace and security reporting, and the extent to which media in your countries are able to engage the WPS agenda in addressing these issues of representation of women and their perspectives in media and security reporting. Comfort, let's start with you.
So I think the media, first of all, is a key instrument in helping people understand what the women peace and security agenda is first of all about, translating this for other peace builders and other actors on the field, because sometimes they're not familiar with this, and then to tell the stories in the way that promotes peace but also highlights women not only as victims, as we are seen often, but as key actors, negotiators, mediators, and solutions to this conflicts that we have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I really want to also expand a bit more on some of the things you were saying earlier on about the trauma for you as journalists reporting some of these stories, these very personal stories of women in conflict. How do you deal with that process of trauma, right? The traumatic experience of reporting. And, what kind of mechanisms would you like to see from the WPS community available for you as a journalist who is experiencing trauma yourself?
First of all, I would say that female journalists in Cameroon and also in other African countries that I've exchanged with have not received sufficient training. Usually we go into conflict reporting before thinking about, hey, but what is needed? Conflict doesn't ring a bell or alert you. So it happens and then you're thrown in the middle of it to report, sometimes without adequate preparation, without adequate coverage. Dr. Yamisi, we had a session with AWIM a month or so ago where we asked about 100 women if they had social insurance, and they said no. So think about you going out without insurance coverage to report on a protest, to report on some conflict. We've had women harassed in the crowds, beaten up without social insurance. If they lose an arm, it's on them. If they get sick, it's on them. So our context is first of all very, very difficult because, like I said, once you're reporting on women, peace and security, you become a target.
Amal, I know you've spoken quite passionately earlier on about kind of the experiences that women in Sudan are having and the need for their voices. So, what are your reflections on the extent to which media in Sudan has been able to engage with the WPS agenda? And in particularly when you think about its reporting of women's perspectives?
We have to strengthen those women. From my experience, I have been punished and I have been like a lot from because I'm doing my work. I feel like I'm doing my work. I'm telling the story of those women. I'm trying to find a solution for those women and for all of us as women. And I found myself in detention. I found myself kicked out of my work. I found myself without salary. I left Sudan in September 2018. After I was in detention and in jails about 15 times. I have been like before I left Sudan, I was in detention for more than months. And I was like, I have been tortured a lot. Till now I have problems with my ear and because they like beat me by electronic stick. And before that, in one of the jails, I was very upset and I sent to jail and I came out with high blood pressure. I was pregnant and I have to leave. And the situation was very dark in Sudan at that time. Went to Germany, invitation from Reporters Without Borders, as I said, and that was like a good time. It's like 2 months scholarship like just to stay away from everything, like just to relax.
Mm-hmm. So now I want to move the conversation on to the ways in which, because one of the things that's coming out from this conversation obviously is around the safety of journalists, and often that is because of the conflict in terms of what journalism practice is and what the powers that be might want it to be. So speaking more broadly now about journalism practice in reports in peace and security, there's often that call for journalists to adopt various forms of journalistic practice. For example, peace journalism, right? So we have all of these kind of terms used for a different kind of journalism during the period. So let me start with you, Comfort. What are your thoughts on these forms of journalism, especially when you consider the fundamental tenets of journalism around objectivity, holding power to account, etc., and how these sometimes conflict with the objectives of governments and policy actors and the desire for journalism to take a different approach?
We have the basics of journalism: fairness, balance. We need to be factual. We need to respect the privacy of others. These basics that we were taught to not change, irrespective of the brand. But one thing I have noticed with the armed conflict in Cameroon is every day there is a new brand of journalism that is being sold to the press. And you also have a lot of NGOs coming in. You have political actors, you have different funders, because some of these brands are actually an agenda. And me as an individual, I will say, if we learn the basics, even when we call it one thing or another, we should look out for the fact that the basics do not change. Because if you factual in your reporting, if you investigate fairly, if you balance your stories, if you give voice to those who are voiceless, at the end of the day, you will do no harm.
Fantastic. And Amal, how would you respond to that as well?
It is important to look for like UN Women, like for international organizations that work for journalists and for women, to know who is doing what. There are many good women journalists who can tell the story in a good way, but you can't see them. Like, for example, to participate in a workshop, maybe in London, because you do not know them. Maybe the higher voice, and all these things make it injustice for women journalists, I think.
Thank you so much, ladies, for speaking with me today on this very important topic around women, media, and peace building and the WPS agenda in Africa. So, to finish off, I want you to each very briefly tell me if there was one action that you would like our listeners to take today based on all that we've discussed. What would that action be? So, first of all, let's start with you, Amal.
I would say training and networking are the most important aspects for peace building for women.
Fantastic. And how about you, Comfort?
I would say networking is something I would encourage those who are listening to take away from a conversation, because I keep thinking about how different my practice would have been if I had heard from female journalists in Liberia and other countries that had gone through an armed conflict, to know what they lived through, to know what your strategies were.
Fantastic. So more opportunities for collaboration, for sharing best practices and experiences. Thank you so much, ladies. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you for listening to She Stands for Peace, a podcast series where thought leaders and peace builders share their reflections and best practices in the women, peace and security agenda in Africa. I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, and this podcast was produced by the United Nations Office to the African Union with the generous support of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Don't forget to join the conversation using the hashtag She Stands for Peace.